Welcome to this first session of academic year 2019 of the InterAgency Brown-Bag Lecture Series. I'm Rod Cox. I work with the Simon Center, which is part of the Commandant General Staff College Foundation. And on behalf of our partners, the Commandant General Staff School, Colonel Rob Alt and Mr. Marv Nichols, we welcome you to this InterAgency Lecture Series. The purpose of the series is to enhance your interagency education while you're here, and to bring awareness to the greater Fort Leavenworth community of some of the assets that are resident here on the faculty. This lecture series is made possible by a couple of our sponsors, first being the Perot Foundation, and secondly here our local sponsor, the First Command Financial Planning Services. So thanks to Lonnie and his folks that are here, where I know you're here, so thank you very much. We appreciate your support. A couple of administrative announcements, please. The next Brown Bag will be on 24 September. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. We've got a chart over there, if you haven't seen them posted around, that has the activities, each monthly presentation throughout the year. It's posted. I urge you to take a look at that and update your calendars as you leave here from that poster. But we'll see you here on the 24th of September, same time, same place. Secondly, I invite you to an activity that we are now in our 5th year of sponsoring, and that's the annual Celebration of International Friendship. It's going to be held on the 4th of October down at the Kaufman Center, which is in downtown Kansas City. It's one of the highlight attractions of our area, and the intent is for us to welcome your international students, your fellow class members, and some of you are here, to the greater Kansas City community. Tickets are on sale now. The website is live as effective today, so I'd urge you to go to the Kaufman website. There's a poster over there that gives you the exact address, and you're welcome to purchase tickets there. So we would invite you to come and help us welcome officially your fellow classmates, your international fellows, and their spouses. One of the things that we do at the Simon Center and the Foundation is provide you a publication opportunity. Already online, but here today is our newest edition of the Interagency Journal. You'll see these floating around. I urge you to pick up a copy and also think about publication opportunities that could be available to you. Lastly, this lecture is being recorded for the distance learning students and at our fellow students at the satellite campuses, as well as it'll be hung for the interagency practitioners at my website. So what that means is if you have questions or as you engage with our speaker, please use one of the microphones either at the back of the crowd or at the table when you talk so that your question can be recorded and picked up on the tape. Please come in. The Department of State is one of, if not the most important partner that the Department of Defense has as we represent the United States around the world. In this era of Twitter and the ever-shortening news cycle, American statecraft has continued very much at an increased pace and is also undergoing a lot of fundamental changes. This brown bag discussion will broadly review the conduct of U.S. diplomacy in the current global environment, encompassing political, economic, and social considerations. This will also serve as a primer for those of you that may have touched a State Department person during a deployment. And I urge you to think about, okay, you've now got a seasoned Foreign Service officer here. What would you like to ask them about how the State Department does business or an observation that you made while downrange? We're privileged to have present today Mr. Matt Roth, a senior Foreign Service officer with over 20 years service in the world of diplomacy. He currently serves as the Commandant's Distinguished Chair of Diplomacy here at the Commandant General Staff College and is the Department of State's liaison to the Combined Arms Center. His area of published research is the relationship between diplomatic and military actors and subnational governments. Prior to this assignment, Mr. Roth was the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Kigali, Rwanda, and over the course of more than 2 decades in the Foreign Service, he has served in Washington, D.C. and in embassies across Africa and Latin America. Mr. Roth has a master's degree in public administration with a specialization in urban planning and city and local government from the University of Kansas, as well as a bachelor's degree in political science and Latin American area studies from the same university. He speaks Portuguese, Spanish, German, and Italian, as well as English. Please welcome Mr. Matt Roth.
already fell out, so thanks. Oh, thank you, Rod, for that very kind introduction. And I do wish to express my appreciation to the Simon Center for putting on this very critical series of lectures. The interagency is absolutely fundamental to how we conduct our national security policy. And this is a great opportunity for those defense elements to learn about their partners. In addition, I want to emphasize that the Simon Center is an incredible resource, and I urge you to take advantage of it if you have not yet had the opportunity. And speaking of resources, I do want to recognize some of the interagency partners that are here on the campus. First off, from the Defense Intelligence Agency, Mr. Roe Jackson. Also from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Ralph Irwin. From the Army Space and Missile Defense Command, Tom Gray. And then we also have a representative of the Central Intelligence Agency who's not with us today. But take advantage of those resources as well. You have a great deal of expertise here to draw upon. Just a quick roadmap of where I would like to go with this. The State Department has a very rigid policy on what I can and cannot say in terms of a slide deck. And some of those points I think are probably things that many of you already know. So I'm actually going to try and move through them fairly quickly. And then hopefully leave the majority of the session open for questions so that we can have a little bit more of a free-flowing conversation about those topics that are of interest to you. So just a little bit of the historical antecedents of the State Department. It's worth noting that it was the first agency, or the first federal agency that was established. And as a part of that, being the first agency, it has a few unusual responsibilities that have stayed with the State Department over the course of over 200 years. One of which, for example, the Office of the Geographer of the United States is actually part of the State Department. It seems a bit odd being a foreign policy entity that we would do that, but that was one of our first responsibilities. Also, we are the keeper of the Great Seal. So another kind of unique thing that we do. Our first diplomat, as you can see, was Ben Franklin. And Tom Jefferson was the first Secretary of State. I also want to point out that the State Department is one of the 4 statutory intelligence agencies. I think it's worth noting that intelligence, overt or covert, are just 2 sides of the same coin. At the end of the day, part of the intent of the national security structure is to provide our decision makers with the best information possible, be it an overt fashion or a covert fashion. Well, what do we do? What does the State Department actually do? We have a fairly specific vision, and it's about promoting democratic values and seeking a prosperous world for all. I think that those are 2 standards that we've hewed to for the entire time that we've been around. How that comes out into the strategic goals as part of the national security strategy, as you can see here, we focus on a number of different areas. I will not go into those in depth. I think that they're fairly self-explanatory. But what do we actually do when we're overseas? At the end of the day, we're the eyes and ears of the United States government on the ground in pretty much every country in the world. We promote American interests. We protect American citizens. And that takes a number of different forms. Just to give you a sense for what the State Department can do for an individual, let's say the state of Kansas, here we are. About 5 years ago, some diplomats in a country in Latin America negotiated a treaty that resulted in creating 200 jobs in Wichita. 2 years ago, diplomats in a country in Africa were able to get a concession for natural gas out of one country that resulted in 40 jobs for a supplier out of Topeka. Those are just 2 examples. And if you go to the State Department website, we have a really neat little map that you can click on every state in the union, and just a brief overview of some of the things that are happening in that state as a result of what the State Department has done. 70th Secretary of State is Mr. Mike Pompeo. Was recently a congressman from the great state of Kansas. Worth noting that it is the ranking member of cabinet and is in succession for the presidency. Obviously, his 2 major responsibilities are to serve as the policy advisor to the President on foreign policy, and then also to represent the United States as the face of America overseas. What does the State Department look like? We're fairly small, and I think you can see some of the comparisons here. Remember, the Department of Defense has nearly 3 million employees. State Department has a whopping 75,000. And it's worth noting that the vast majority of the employees of the State Department aren't even American. They are the local staff that work in our embassies overseas. As you can see there, it's nearly 50,000, so what, 2/3. Oops. More broadly, the vast majority of all of our staff is overseas, Americans and local staff. We do maintain some presence in the United States at a few places, like Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, but the majority of the people that are in the United States are in Washington, D.C. Just a couple comments on, go back here, on our workforce. The State Department workforce has reduced by about 10% since December of 2016. We have had the second most percentage-wise reduction in staff of any cabinet agency since December of 2016. Department of Education is number 1. Worth noting that foreign assistance and foreign policy makes up less than 1% of the U.S. budget. Get pretty good bang for the buck for that small investment. What's interesting, there's been 2 or 3 studies that have been done on the perception in America of how much money we spend on foreign policy. Anybody have a sense, any idea of what people think we spend on foreign policy? Probably should ask this question before I put the slide up, but the average American thinks that we spend 1/4 of our budget on foreign affairs, when in reality it's less than 1%. You can see there that the defense budget for 19 was a proposed nearly $700 billion. The proposed increase for fiscal year 2019 for the Department of Defense is over twice the actual budget of the entire State Department. Let that sink in for a minute. The increase for this last year, or for next year, is twice the entire budget of the State Department. State Department is basically broken into 6 secretariats, 6 undersecretariats that focus on specific issues: political affairs, economic affairs, public affairs. And under political affairs, I think this is probably what's most critical for folks in the Department of Defense, because those track fairly closely with the combatant commands. So there's a rough equivalent for each of the combatant commands within the State Department. Overseas, we have representation in nearly 200 countries. Actually more than, I think 190 countries, yeah. Words matter, and I think this is worth spending a little bit of time talking about this. An embassy is not a consulate. A consulate is not an embassy, okay? Embassies are only located in capital cities of foreign countries, okay? If it says embassy, you know it's in the capital, full stop. If it's a consulate, it could be in any other city in the country, but it is not an embassy, okay? Within consulates, there's a number of different rank levels depending on how big they are. But consulate generals are a little bigger than, consulates general are a little bigger than regular consulates. I put up here interest sections. Currently we have 0 interest sections, but we did have one. We were part of the Swiss embassy in Havana, Cuba, but we recently reopened there. But we keep that definition on the books because there is hope that we will have something similar take place with a couple other countries, including Iran and North Korea. Overseas, also worth noting that the chief of mission of an embassy, usually called an ambassador, is the personal representative of the president. In other words, theoretically reports directly to the president. In terms of protocol, that would mean, for example, that if you had the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the ambassador, and the president in the room, it would be the ambassador that sits next to the president. So it's a very direct personal relationship. Currently, I put roughly 60% of our ambassadors overseas are career Foreign Service officers like myself, and about 40% are political appointees. Those numbers vary a little bit depending on the administration that's in place, and it also depends a little bit on where we are in that administration. So you find at the beginning of administrations there's there's lower numbers of political appointees. By the end of an administration there's slightly higher numbers, just as chits get pulled in and so forth. Going back to words matter, in every embassy overseas there's a deputy chief of mission. That is always a Foreign Service officer, and when the ambassador is away, the deputy chief of mission takes on the power of the chief of mission, but doesn't get the title of ambassador, but gets the title of charge d'affaires, which is fairly self-explanatory. Overseas, what does an embassy look like? As I pointed out before, you've got I can't see it on this thing, the president, and then directly below is the ambassador. In every embassy overseas, you're going to have these sections: your admin support, consular, public diplomacy, economic and political affairs. And then depending on the country, you'll have a number of different representations. For example, the largest embassy of the world now is Mexico City. It was for some time Baghdad, but Mexico City has traditionally been the largest. There are 103 different agencies of the United States government resident at that embassy, just given the vast nature of our relationship with Mexico. The main challenge in any embassy overseas, obviously in this type of environment, is coordination. And so there is a rough equivalency overseas of the National Security Council. It's called the country team, the embassy country team, and it's usually heads of the major sections of the embassy that will meet and provide guidance or perspectives to the ambassador. It does not have to be every agency. It's up to the discretion of the chief of mission what that country team will look like. In Mexico City, for example, the most recent ambassador had 3 country teams. And basically, because just there was no way they could get that many people into the room at any given time, so made the decision that, okay, for economic issues, we'll have one country team. For immigration issues, we'll have another, so on and so forth. As I said, the ambassador is the personal representative of the president, and that has ramifications for defense entities. With the exception of those uniforms that are under direct combatant command, the ambassador is the end-all be-all for any military in country. And I would add to that 2 things. The ambassador still has the choice to allow or not allow an individual into the country, irrespective of what control they're under. So even if you're under combatant command control, if the ambassador decides that you're not welcome, you're not going to go. And as a practical matter, it's probably best, even if you are under combatant command, to coordinate intensely with the mission in the country. It's for the best. You really don't want to step on too many toes. There's one story out of a country in Eastern Europe where a junior briefer from combatant command went into the ambassador and said, "I'm here to give you an informational brief on an activity that we will be undertaking in your country." And the ambassador promptly kicked the fellow out of the country and called the combatant command and said, "When you're ready to send me someone who wants to play ball, we'll do that." You want to avoid that situation to the extent that you can. I think this is important to note that there are slight differences between the combatant commands and our geographic bureaus in the State Department, it's not a perfect match. However, one of the best things from the State Department perspective that happened was AFRICOM, because it simplified very much who we talk to in our countries overseas. One of the challenges that we do have, though, is that we don't do regional planning particularly well. So when a combatant command wants to do a multinational project or in various countries, the combatant commander still has to coordinate with 3 or 4 different embassies. There's no one direct parallel or direct counterpart that they can go to. There's been discussion for over a decade to co-locate combatant commands and our geographic bureaus. As a practical matter, that will probably never happen. However, what you do see is a great deal of cross-pollination between the Department of Defense and the Department of State at the bureau level. So we have lots of political advisors from the State Department in the combatant commands and significant numbers of military officers represented in our geographic bureaus. In embassies overseas, there is always a defense attaché, which now is known as a senior defense official, given that so many embassies have not just Defense Intelligence Agency activities, but also military assistance. So there's one individual. It could be the defense, it could be from DIA, it could be from whatever the assistance program is, but there is one individual who is the overall end-all be-all for representing the Department of Defense. The names change in different embassies depending on what the issue is as to what the office looks like, but there always is a senior defense official. I want to leave it at that. I wanted to open this up for questions from the broader group. I suspect that there are some very specific political questions that I was not allowed to put into the slide deck that are probably of more interest to you all. So with that, I close and I open it for questions.
I'll remind you, please use the microphone. They'll control it back there. Just go forward if you're on for a question.
Sir.
Colonel Paul Riley. I work on the other side of post at the Joint Center for International Security Force Assistance. So security assistance, security cooperation. I've been a security cooperation officer in an embassy, and I was in Embassy Tbilisi and Embassy Kabul. So can you tell us about the challenges that the department had for a period of time where there was a lack of mid-level management because of what it was like for the department having a situation where a lot of ambassadors weren't being approved yet, and other gaps and vacancies weren't being filled.
As currently?
I don't know if it's changed or evolved.
I think currently there are 60 ambassadorial positions that are empty. 5 out of the 6 undersecretary positions are empty. Every single of our 4-star equivalents has retired and has not been replaced. Depending on what numbers you want to believe, or I've seen one figure that suggests that as much as nearly 2/3 of our senior cadre has either retired or resigned since December 2016. I don't. If that's what the Foreign Service Association claims, you ask the State Department, they say the opposite is true. I think probably it's somewhere in the middle. A couple of things that have happened because of this vacancy, this lack of senior staff. It's harder to get things done, quite frankly. In every embassy overseas, there is the deputy chief of mission who can take on that role of the chargé d'affaires. But at the end of the day, that's not the person representative of the president and all of the influence and power that comes with that. It makes it harder to have the interaction with the host government, certainly. And in the current situation, for example, Mike Pompeo is working obviously very hard on the issues related to North Korea. He has a very limited staff on North Korea because practically that entire office has retired or resigned in the past 2 years. So he's had to draw upon other entities, specifically the CIA, to support him because there isn't the staff at the State Department to do that. So it is a serious challenge. Now, I want to caveat that, though. Every administration, and I've worked for 8 secretaries of state, 4 different presidents, and every transition comes with lots of challenges. So while there are those that right now suggest that this is unprecedented, I don't know that I would go that far. It's a bit unusual, but it's not the first time that we've had significant staffing gaps at the senior levels. So there's that. Now, in terms of mid-level, after the peace dividend of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the mid-90s, we were reducing our budgets. There was a significant gap at our mid-level, which created problems, I think, on two levels. One, junior officers were not getting guidance or perspective from more experienced officers, and were being forced into positions that they weren't ready to take on. And obviously, if you're not ready to do some of the work, you're going to make some mistakes that perhaps you wouldn't otherwise. So there's that, and then at the same time, the seniors did not have good XOs to draw upon to do implementation work, the mid-level manager type things. That resulted in fairly fast promotions of junior officers into levels that they probably weren't ready for, and they kind of had to learn in their jobs to do the mid-level work. And then behind them, we've now hired a significant number. We're an upper-out system, so just like the U.S. military. And I should note, the Foreign Service, we are commissioned officers. There are 6 commissioned officer corps, or 8, excuse me, of the U.S. government. We are one of those. And so we're an upper-out system, and so if you do not get promoted, you get pushed out, but at the same time, you can't come in midway through. You have to start at the bottom and work your way up. So whenever we have like these massive gaps, it takes years to write that system. Does that answer your question? Yes, okay, thank you. Next question, please. Sir.
Good? All right. Captain Jerry Champion, just CGSC student here this year. Pulling the conversation a little bit down from the political stratosphere, for going into mid-level officer management positions in whatever organizations we go to. The only linkages I understand between the Department of State and Department of Defense are some of the ones that you mentioned between very senior leaders and their political advisors. So down at mid-level officership management where we're at, are there any linkages between Department of Defense and Department of State, and how do we use those linkages to make sure we don't have competing priorities in whatever country we're in?
Absolutely, there are the linkages. First off, I want to say that the relationship between the Department of Defense and the Department of State is probably the best of any 2 cabinet-level agencies. There's been a dedicated effort by both over the especially last 20 years, to really bring the 2 agencies together in terms of messaging, in terms of communication. The national security strategy, obviously the Department of Defense has drawn from that to create its QDR. The State Department now does a similar one. It's the QDDR, the Quadrennial for Diplomacy and Development in conjunction with USAID. That was a very conscious effort to make sure that our strategic goals were aligned together, both defense and state. How that plays out on the ground. A couple different ways. In every embassy overseas where there's a defense office, there's also going to be a section that does political military affairs, okay? Now, it might be one person, it might be half a person, but there is one person in every embassy that's charged with those duties. And that becomes kind of your one-stop shop at the mid-level. As I noted, there's a lot of political advisors from the State Department in the combatant commands. A lot of them are 04, 05 equivalent, 03, 04 equivalents. So there's that mid-level representation to people that you can go to directly on specific issues. So there is a pretty decent amount of back and forth. And like I mentioned, in the State Department, we just created, I think, another 50 positions for military officers to come in and work in embedded positions in the State Department. So, next question. Sir.
On the, I think it was the previous slide, you had a list of different positions that military officers serving within the embassies. Could you speak a little bit more on those and what they do?
So again, I think a lot depends on the size of the mission. If you're talking about foreign area officers, you'll find in the largest embassies several representatives of each of the major defense entities. You'll find an Air Force attaché, you'll find a Marine Corps attaché, you may even have an assistant attaché. So each of those are going to be charged with very specific analysis duties with relation to the host government. You know, the sticky wicket is the security cooperation because it's just so fluid and, dare I say, nebulous that it's really hard to kind of like put that into a box and respond to your question directly. But a lot of different countries will have, you know, 3 or 4 different experts working specifically on, say, FMF or whatever with that specific country. One of the things that's kind of odd is you can sometimes have a senior defense official that is of a lower rank than others that are actually in his office. So I think there's an example in Western Europe of a country where the SDO is an 06, but there's an assistance official that is a 1-star. But the senior defense official is actually the 06. So, yeah. Next question. Sir.
Sergeant Major Dan Langen, can you talk a little bit about the episode earlier this year where we had the mutual expelling of diplomats between Russia and the U.S. and what kind of capabilities that affected in our embassy in Moscow?
Thank you for that question. That was one of the things that I would have loved to put into my slide deck, but I was not allowed to. So, you know, statecraft has not changed that much over the last couple hundred years, and the expelling of diplomats is something that happens actually quite regularly. It's almost a badge of honor in the State Department to get expelled at some point in your career. I have not been expelled, but I am persona non grata in one country in Africa because of some things that were attributed to me in WikiLeaks. It's not as serious, I think, as it's made out to be. It makes good press. And it's kind of a tit for tat that you do at a governing level to show your displeasure with each other. The people that we expelled from the United States back to Russia had been identified as intelligence assets, and they were all under official cover. That was, it was very specific as a response to some of the things that had happened earlier in the year, and it was also associated with what had happened in the United Kingdom. So they, in response, kicked our diplomats out. And what the Russians did in this particular instance was focus on people that weren't necessarily related to intelligence in any way, but were very critical to mission operation. So, for example, the people in the consular section that do visas, they basically wiped out our visa section. So now, any American that needs a passport has real trouble getting it because there's like one person left that has to do the work for the entire country. So they went a different route with us and tried to debilitate our ability to do our day-to-day functions. We were specific about trying to cut off their ability to do intelligence work. Answer your question? Next question. Oh, hi.
So we have this current shift, Monique Guerrero, I run an interagency program here. We have a current shift now in our curriculum here, and we're talking more towards major combat operations and those kind of things. Could you speak a little bit to how the Department of State and some of the other agencies particularly end up playing into that? As far as, like, I know when I was in Baghdad a few years ago, we had a huge interagency presence that created quite a bit of the policy and things we were doing on the ground. And if you could speak to that a little bit, I'd appreciate it.
So in the course of some of the operations that happened in the Middle East, there was recognition that the State Department, well, two things. One, we realized how understaffed we were to take on many of the responsibilities that were being given to us. And so we had to scramble with a number of different systems to bring in bodies, basically. Some were successful, some were not. And I think that many of the more negative experience that our defense colleagues have had are a result of the State Department's very, emergency effort to bring in staff that perhaps weren't right for the specific moment. A lot of contractors that weren't even actually State Department employees, that didn't have any experience with the State Department, and then were representing the State Department very poorly to our defense colleagues. But the whole idea of the PRT, the Provincial Reconstruction Team, was kind of the State Department's way to figure out, okay, how do we get our people on the ground embedded with defense assets in a way that they can work closely together. From my personal perspective, so we'll be very clear about that, I don't know that the State Department should be involved with major combat operations because, we should either be there before or after, but it's not our wheelhouse to be there in the middle of the battle. I mean, we don't wear the uniforms, we don't have the guns, so whether or not we should be actively involved in that process is questionable from my personal perspective. I think that if we can continue to provide, civilian perspective to the decision makers via like the political advisors or whatever, that's fine. But more or less, to not answer your question, I'm not sure that we should be in the middle of that sort of thing. So, yeah. Thank you. Next question, sir.
So I'm Major Heidi. I'm one of the students here at CGSOC. I'm curious to know, so you all are out on the front lines essentially for the U.S. government and have been the subject of targeting attacks over the years, certainly the embassy bombings, the Benghazi attacks. And so I'm wondering to what extent the increased security requirements that are now placed upon Department of State employees, diplomatic security, et cetera, how does that impact your ability to do your job? And to what extent does the militarization of an embassy help or impair with your ability to gain access to these countries?
So the job of a diplomat is to get out and to talk to people and interact and gain the experience necessary to provide the decision makers with good perspective. When you have a giant Fortress America building behind the moat with the alligators in it, it's hard, one, to get out into the community to do those kind of interactions. And frankly, it's hard to get in. So it really limits people's willingness to come in to see you. So unfortunately, the security stance has had ramifications in our ability to do our job. And there's this, dare I say, creative tension always between the security requirements and the desire, to do the interaction. I think a brutally honest example of that is Benghazi, okay? Ambassador Stevens, I'm fairly certain, was told by his security chief to not go to Benghazi. But that's what every security chief says to every chief of mission in pretty much every circumstance. That's their job, okay? It's the responsibility of the chief of mission to put that into a context and say, okay, I understand that there are these security concerns, but these foreign policy goals are more important and override any security concerns. And 99.9% of the time, it's okay. I was in Peru during the worst of the Shining Path. I was in Colombia during the worst of the FARC. And every security chief would basically say no to everything because that's their job. And you don't take it personally. And from their perspective, it's the danger outweighs any potential benefit. So it's up then to the specific officer or the chief of mission to say, okay, within that range, what do I do? But frankly, it's gotten harder over time. And especially in countries that are effectively war zones, say Afghanistan, it begs the question whether or not the job can actually even be done, okay? Because if you're a civilian and you're going out in a caravan of 40 vehicles with, X number of, folks with very large guns, what are you saying? What are you able to do? What sort of conversation can you have? It's not a natural, normal, comfortable conversation under any circumstance when those things are happening. So security is a challenge. I think over time, we've tried to balance better that creative tension. And so you see embassies that take on certain concepts of design that recognize the security, but also, or at least inviting enough that it may still be Fortress America, but at least you don't see the crocodiles in the moat anymore. It's covered over with flowers or something like that. So, next question, sir.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Brian Batson, instructor in the Department of Distance Education. I just returned from being the chief of plans for Embassy Baghdad. I have a question for you. How does the State Department select their officers, and then how do they track them? Who goes into management? Who goes into political affairs? And then a third part, if you don't mind, how do you select and train planners for the Department of State?
Okay, hold on here. Okay, so to get into the Foreign Service, you take a test. It's a civil service exam, basically. And it's, now I think there's several different parts, but the two basic parts are a written examination and then basically an oral interview. It's more or less been the same exercise for many, many years. But everybody has to do it. And I believe the numbers keep changing and actually are trending downward. But oftentimes we'll have as many as 25,000 people take the examination, and usually less than 100 are finally accepted into the Foreign Service. So in theory, you're getting the best of that universe of applicants. Say in theory because obviously there's lots of talented people that don't make it in, and I've seen some that perhaps could have used a little more talent, so that did get in. But it's a fairly rigorous process, and we've now added on personality analysis, trying to evaluate, people's emotional intelligence as to whether or not they'll function in a lot of these environments. And I think that, that's in part a response to some of the challenges in war-torn countries where we're finding that resilience is a critical factor in your ability to function as a diplomat. And perhaps a written examination doesn't necessarily measure resilience very well. So we've tried to find new ways to make sure that we're getting people that are able to take on these very difficult situations. So that's how you get in. And the other question was on planning?
How do you select and train planners?
Okay, well, so quite frankly, the State Department traditionally has not been a center of excellence when it comes to strategic planning. And in fact, the State Department didn't do any strategic planning until General Powell became the Secretary of State. So you all have decades of more experience on these issues than we do at State. I think one of the other challenges that we've got is so much of what we do is very difficult to measure. How do you measure an improvement in democracy? How do you measure better governance? And so the metrics are a bit of a challenge, even once we do do the strategic planning. In terms of actually training planners, it's the generalists that take the Foreign Service exam that get in that decide to make that part of their career that go down that path. Most Foreign Service officers are exposed quite regularly now to strategic planning. Every embassy overseas does a strategic plan, and usually officers, everyone, it's all hands on board or involved in that process, actually including the defense attache's office usually gets involved as well. So most people are conversant in the issues. We did recognize, I believe in the early 2000s, that there were so many different pots of money that were being used in foreign assistance, we didn't actually know how much we were spending on foreign assistance. You say, okay, Belarus, how much do we spend? We don't know the answer because you've got a pot of money coming out of the Department of Agriculture, a pot of money coming out of the Department of Commerce, which are domestic accounts, so you don't automatically think, oh, it's foreign assistance. And then you find something over in the Department of Justice. So we actually stood up a bureau, it's called F, that its entire reason for being is to capture what we do in terms of foreign assistance overseas. And so there are long-time civil servants that have been there now for 15 or 20 years that have focused only on that issue and are very expert in it. So, was there another question there too? Okay, thank you. Next question.
Time for one more.
Sir.
Sir, Lieutenant Law. So I was an aide to a foreign policy advisor for my last tour. And so do you see the role of the foreign policy advisor and major staff changing in the near future, given changes in relationships between Department of State and Department of Defense?
I think it'll only get better, and I think there'll be more of it. We will never co-locate our combatant commands and regional bureaus. It's just, there are so many practical considerations there that we're not going to be able to overcome that. But I think that the intermediate, or the solution, if you will, or the stopgap, is just continue to increase the number of political advisor positions that are embedded in the combatant commands and the number of military officers that are in the regional bureaus in the State Department. And actually, I want to go back, there was a comment on militarization of foreign policy. And I don't think I actually spoke to that, and I want to in just a minute. It's a thing, it's a reality. And it's in part, as I alluded to, the resources challenge. The Department of Defense is just a lot bigger and has a lot more resources. And whenever there's a vacuum of any kind, those with the resources are probably going to try and fill it in some way. That's the nature of the beast. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. When you have military assets making diplomatic decisions, however, that's where it gets a little bit more complicated and probably is not for the best. But the reality, our current reality, both budgetary and in terms of staffing, is that the military is going to have a significant role. What I've told my young officers in the State Department is that it's absolutely critical to learn the tribal language of defense and to seek out the opportunities to work with the Department of Defense every chance they get. Some of those opportunities in the moment may not necessarily appear to be great career moves, but I don't think you can be a good diplomat until you can speak the language of defense. And similarly, I would make the case for military officers that it's absolutely critical that you learn the tribal language of diplomacy. It'll make you a better officer. From a self-interest as a senior diplomat, if I know what my defense assets are, and I know more or less what our strategic goals are, which are almost always roughly in sync, I can say, how can I craft these military assets to move in such a direction that it meets my diplomatic ends? So I don't necessarily see military being involved in diplomacy as a bad thing, and it's a practical reality, so you embrace it and you work with it. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I'll stick around a little bit longer if you all have questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Appreciate you all coming. Next brown bag will be 24 September, National Geospatial. It's on the chart over here. I urge you as you go out, if you didn't sign the roster, put the contact information and then also populate your calendars with the next set of events, as well as consider signing up for our international welcome. Awesome. Thank you very much for coming.